Folks, thank you for joining. My name is Matt Thomas, and you're tuned into the USGS Landslide Hazards Seminar. This meeting is hosted by the Landslide Hazards Program and co-organized with contributions from Stephen Slaughter and Jamie Kostelnik. And for those of you that are new to this meeting, you have the ability to submit questions via the chat window or to use the raise your hand feature in combination with your microphone or video camera. We're going to wait until the end of today's presentation to take questions. So in the meantime, please just do your best to make sure your microphone is muted and your video camera is off when you aren't intending to speak. Jen, thank you so much for introducing today's speaker.
Hi, thanks, Matt, and hi, everyone. It's my honor to introduce Philip Prince today. He is a project geologist with us at Appalachian Landslide Consultants, and we are really fortunate to have Phil on the team. Phil started his studies in geology at Furman University and got his BS in Earth and Environmental Sciences in 2004, and then moved on to a little later to get his PhD from Virginia Tech in 2011, where he taught for about 4 years, and then went on to work with the Virginia Department of Mines, Minerals, and Energy from 2017 to 2019. And he has so much experience in the Valiant Ridge and the Blue Ridge. He now does not only continued mapping for the Virginia Survey, but with us, he does landslide mapping, property evaluations, and writes really interesting blogs that are posted on the ALC website, as well as he has a personal blog that's published by AGU. And one piece of information that I think you all want to know before hearing his talk is that I don't think there's anyone out there that has looked at more LIDAR in the Valiant Ridge and Blue Ridge than Phil has. So you are in good hands with this talk. Phil, I'll turn it over to you and look forward to it.
All right, thank you, Jen, and you may be right about that. If you read the email promoting this talk and are actually looking at the screen, you'll see that all of that experience Jen talked about has led me to amend my title a little bit from something that was really wordy to, do you see the really monster big landslide in this image? The answer is probably no. Certainly the answer for many years for me was no. You're looking at Sinking Creek Mountain. This is in Craig County, Virginia. The view is actually from Craig Creek Road. It's a pretty major road, which means 2 cars can drive down it at once in this area. You're looking at Siluro-Devonian Sandstone Ridge. Pictures taken up section from Devonian Shale, and that ridge you're looking at is actually dipping towards you. So the strata that are holding up the ridge are actually underneath the photographer here. What's interesting about the view is these sort of foothills, for lack of a better word, these little knobs or hills that you see on the flank of the ridge there. And these are going to be pretty significant to how this story starts today. And again, if you're not really looking for something here, they're sort of inconspicuous, but Art Schultz in the mid-1980s took a look at those during some larger scale mapping in this area, and they meant something to him. And specifically, they reminded him of something that he had seen actually out in the Colorado Front Range. So now I will take you out towards Fort Collins, Colorado. This is the Horsetooth Reservoir here. You can see a little tile of LIDAR that I have tossed into Google Earth. And if we zoom in on that LIDAR tile, see a similar dip slope ridge. Of course, this is as a part of a thick skin uplift instead of the thin skin Valiant Ridge, but hogback ridge, sedimentary strata dipping towards the bottom of the screen. And you got these really conspicuous sort of blocks here. And there's a few of them. And then this really, for lack of a better word, kind of lumpy domain. They're pretty big. If you were walking around on one, you would be impressed by its size, but you would note that it's bedrock, and it would be possible to measure strikes and dips on these sandstone outcrops. And this is actually a big set of landslides, of intact block slides, where stratigraphy is basically preserved and intact in the blocks. They've been sort of folded a little bit as they've displaced down slope. And at the time Art Schultz was out looking at this had already been interpreted and identified as a slide feature. And some of the details of what you're seeing here reminded him of what he saw in Sinking Creek Mountain. And that sort of started the wheels turning and allowed him to make that interpretation that was quite significant. That previous image to me still, after all that LiDAR looking, I don't immediately see slope movement in there. I really like physical models. So I'm going to show you now a simple physical model of a dip slope ridge with slope movement on it related to a weak sliding plane. Now, if you compare what we got here in the physical model to what you see out there near Fort Collins, slide block in red, the lumpy stuff is just disaggregated debris that is presumably associated with part of that slide block breaking apart, like you saw happen here. So that's the type of comparison that we're trying to make. So this doesn't look like, I guess, certain types of landslides or slope movement. Its physical scale makes that hard to see. And also sort of the details of movement are unique, but sure enough, it's a reproducible style, and one that is characterized by this sort of debris apron and these synclinal bedrock slide blocks and this sort of gap, which is, I think, what Art called it in one of his publications, but that's just the exposed failure plane. This is a shale-rich interval with these sandstone blocks that detach and glide along it there. So comparing that back to the physical model, that's what you're seeing. And again, the key points that you could identify, even if you couldn't see sort of the big picture like we see now due to vegetative cover, just the physical size of this system, would be a dip change associated with slide blocks, a big bunch of debris, the slide blocks themselves that are flats or synclinal. Sometimes they're actually complexly folded, almost like you might expect from a tectonic feature, and that gap that's been laid bare by the removal of the overlying stratigraphy. So going back to the Appalachians, back to the Valley and Ridge, this is the best stuff that was around in the mid 80s, and there's a little bit of irregularity here. This is kind of hard to see slope movement in, but if you throw some LiDAR in there, things get a lot better. The knobs that were visible in the title slide are actually the toe of one of these big slide blocks. Compare that again to the physical model, and hopefully you'll see a little bit of resemblance there. Pretty big feature, over 1 kilometer across on this one large detached block. Everything that you're looking at here actually is displaced to some degree. This block has glided farther than its neighbors here. And the debris apron, the block, and then the gap up there, just like we saw in that other Colorado Front Range locality. So sort of making this connection, Art and others did quite a bit of work in the Valley and Ridge, and it turns out that features like this tend to be pretty pervasive. You can map these in the field almost like bedrock. If you're down on the toes here, you will see what look like intact sandstone beds dipping back into the hill. Of course, if you get up to the top of the summit there will be typical dip slope dipping downhill. And to the ground observer, again, to emphasize, this is not something that jumps out to you as a slope movement. It is specifically associated with a strong sandstone interval that's really just sandwiched between a variety of shales. And that is pretty characteristic of much of the southern and central Appalachian Valley and Ridge. There's a tremendous amount of shale in the stratigraphy that's deformed to make the thrust sheets and the associated big folds. The topography that you see is related to actually a pretty modestly thick sequence in the Siluro Devonian, and then further up section at the top of the Devonian into the Mississippian, where there's Pennsylvanian rock preserved. That makes pretty big topography too, and it's actually also susceptible to behavior like this. There's just not a lot of that. Most of it's already lost to erosion. So beginning, again, 1985, 1986, Art Schultz, along with Scott Southworth, the USGS, Gene Rader, who was with the Virginia Survey, I think Jerry Bartholomew did some of this, several others, produced actually a number of publications, mostly about the features that you're seeing here on Sinking Creek Mountain. And one of the big attractors was just they were really big. What you're looking at here is about 4 miles of ridge, and everything covered in yellow there is sort of a continuous detached slide block, and it keeps going. I don't think there's anything else in the Appalachians on shore that rivals something like this. It's pretty much a unique feature for sure. Relief is not extreme where this particular feature's occurring. It's greater than in other parts of the valley and ridge, but this style of movement that we're looking at doesn't really seem to depend on huge amounts of topographic relief or steepness to occur. And we'll be talking about that a little bit more as we get into the talk. Dip on this slope's about 25 degrees. Again, this occurs on steeper systems and even slightly flatter ones. For some reason, about 25 degrees seems to be pretty good for making these really, really huge continuous blocks. And there may be a variety of reasons for that. So really huge slide features that have been known for almost 40 years now. They're really physically on the scale of tectonic compressional folds that you might associate with the Alleghanian compression that made the valley and ridge, or the structures that are eroded to make the valley and ridge today. Again, nothing else really like them consistently in the Blue Ridge, for example. And they also happen to look really cool on LiDAR. So that sort of begs the question, are there more of them? And when I say looks great in LiDAR, I mean, you can see things like you're looking at over here. Another little model here, sort of a cutaway of what one of these would look like. There actually is sort of thrust repetition of the sliding stratigraphic interval where it breaks and actually runs over the intact bedding further down the slope. So there is doubling, if you will, of that resistance sliding block, and that's actually very nicely visible in this LiDAR image. The yellow line there is on the failure plane, and you can see intact downslope dipping beds, and then this slide block above it with the slightly synclinal shape that has in effect thrust over and cut off those beds. So and this is thick too. You have to keep in mind this is probably about 100 meters thick, if not more. So it's an impressive system, and again, one that you can now very easily look for with LiDAR imagery. And that was something that I was very interested in doing. And it's like, well, is this only a Sinking Creek Mountain type of thing, or is this something that you can see elsewhere in the valley and ridge? And as it turns out, it's quite pervasive. Everything you've been looking at so far is outlined in these polygons here along the southeast limb of the Sinking Creek anticline. And it's extensive. You can drive for about 20 miles along the ridge there, and every time you look up, everything you're looking at is detached. In reality, going southwest along the same ridge there, the system continues, and it looks something like what you see here. Dips are steeper, so you don't get the huge monster slide blocks, but there is plenty of failure within that strong sandstone interval with shale above and below it. And you can follow that for probably 30 or 40 or 50 miles to the southwest at least, and see a tremendous amount of pretty closely spaced failures like you see there. Something that was interesting to the folks in the 80s was there is a seismic zone nearby. There was some thought that might have contributed to this system, but there was also evidence at the time that there might be a few more of these, maybe kind of up in this area. They were, of course, very difficult to look for without good surface imagery. And that's why I thought it would be cool to take advantage of all this nice USGS and FEMA LiDAR and see what you can see. So I'm going to take you up to the northeast now. The same stratigraphic interval. The structural style is a little bit different. You can see these sort of closed whaleback anticlines here. And if you get to looking closely, they too are absolutely covered in big stratigraphically intact block slides. To take a little bit closer look at one of those, this one's quite nice. I've actually been to it to give you a sense of scale. It's quite large. Of course, all of these little dots and specks on there are boulders that themselves are quite large in person. This one's very easy to access. There's a nice Forest Service road that comes right along the crest of the ridge, actually right along the headscarp of this big feature. And even though this is much smaller than what you see on Sinking Creek Mountain, it's still almost too big to fully appreciate what it represents in terms of hill slope process. It's also completely forested, so it's not really possible to see terribly far in either direction before the density of the trees sort of overtake the bigger impression. A lot of very interesting movement related details on this slope as well. Have these en echelon fissures here that are related to slight movement of that sandstone interval away from this fully displaced slide block here. So this, this is all detached and it's moving, and it's sort of pulling away here and making these big open sort of chasm type of features. And if you compare those, of course, to the scale bar, they look small here. In person on the ground, they're very, very large. The fissures sort of end where slope detachment ends, so they provide a really nice way to actually see just how much of this ridge has faintly detached and slid just a little bit. See an incipient headscarp up there at the top. Of course, it's not this fully developed breakaway like you see here, but it is either on its way to becoming that or was on its way to becoming that. No details of motion, timing, or history seem to be very well understood in any of these features. And a particularly cool feature about this one is what you see down here at the very base of the slope, where the sandstone bedding has actually been sort of rotated outward by downslope advance of the sliding sandstone slab there. So it's just bulged a little bit. You can see a little bit of bulging here on the slope as well. So failure hasn't been, as complete in this area, but this is very much detached and has been mobile. This one's probably my favorite of the whole suite of images, because it just makes such a nice big scar in this otherwise big, smooth sort of whaleback anticline. Again, this is Craig Creek down here. You can see it's beautifully terraced. Hopefully that comes through in the screen share. And that terracing actually goes even further up onto the slope. So there is a history of pretty significant relief production in this part of the world. This is in the James River system. It is much lower in terms of elevation than the adjacent New River system, and it is generally more rugged and gives the observer the sense that relief here is significantly more than it probably was in the fairly recent geologic past. What that might have to do with these slides, again, is anecdotal connection between relief production and instability, but it's really hard to connect the two. Either way, this is the same type of feature we've been looking at so far, and it's also really, really big. That's 1 kilometer across. Something about these that are affecting these smaller kind of whaleback folds tend to make them look smaller to me, but they're all still really big. And of course, with that physical size, if you stood on this southwest end of the scar and looked northeast, you would not really be able to perceive, what kind of feature you're looking at. Significantly here, got these nice little drainages that match up pretty nicely with the laterals. The laterals themselves are probably developed on fractures within the bedrock itself. And once that failure occurs, these little drainages that are utilizing those fractures actually have a good bit more drainage area, and they're now able to access weaker rock as well. So presumably these two little channels are going to grow in size and drainage and become much more effective eroders of this fold. If you look at the other sides of it, there's very little channel activity on it at all. So it just sort of sits there, and as to how that slope would evolve without physical erosion, the sandstones are chemically stable. That's kind of hard to say, and that's going to become important here down the road. So those examples that I just showed you, the breached anticlines, those are northeast of Newcastle, Virginia, and the LiDAR keeps going. So I figure, hey, let's keep seeing what's out there. I'm going to take you further northeast here, actually into a different stratigraphic interval. This is now in the middle and upper Devonian. The rocks you see here that have this much greater drainage density are actually preserved in large synclinal areas in the valley and ridge. They are synclinoria, so they're structural lows, but they're internally quite deformed. And as it turns out, they are equally full of really big rock slope movements. And if you're a LiDAR fan and you're looking at this image while I'm talking, you may have already picked out a few of those. You're looking here for a sense of reference also at the Cowpasture River, and that is flowing from top right to lower left of the screen towards the James River. And just like Craig Creek, it is nicely terraced as well as evidence of relief production. Here, though, specifically, I want to focus on this feature, and you can see two parallel scarps there. One is facing downslope, the other is sort of a counter scarp or an anti-scarp facing upslope. The block that they bound, 560 feet across. So again, it's still really big and would be very difficult to appreciate in person without LiDAR. And if you turn it around from this direction, this is actually a subsiding summit. So this ridge is spreading, and a result of that spreading is an actual net lowering of the summit of the ridge along these two conjugate planes. And where would those meet inside of this ridge? In other words, what depth? How deep is this movement seated? I don't know. You could probably impose some theoretical angles on those planes and get a sense for that. One way or another, this is very much a deep-seated failure. It's still occurring in a sandstone and shale landscape. The topography here is sandstone on top of more deformed shale underneath there. And this is a Sakung style feature, just sort of at the smaller scale, so the same type of ridge spreading and summit lowering that you might see in a post-glacial landscape. Sort of a comparable mechanism here, just at much lower relief, and presumably being a product of mechanical contrast in the bedrock. So another model, I really like this one because you can make a sand ridge with a mobile base plate underneath it, and you can produce a very nice similar sort of Graben style feature there with lowering of the summit. And that would be one way of maybe trying to get some possible constraints on how steep those conjugate failure planes might tilt. But again, very deep seated with the width of the subsiding block there being 560 feet. Presumably, the basal plane that those two conjugate shear planes connect to would be hundreds of feet under the surface. So something really interesting to see. Again, like not a feature that I expected to find when I was initially perusing LiDAR in this part of the world. And there's more of them. It seems to be something that's specifically associated with this stratigraphic interval, again, being the middle and upper Devonian, and the type of topography that it seems to produce within the valley and ridge. And again, if you're looking while I'm talking, you may have picked up on some of these faint scarps that are running from the bottom towards the top of the image. 660 feet wide there, again, a set of conjugate planes. And this one actually has sort of a little internal Graben within this sort of master Graben here. So it's a really interesting arrangement. And of course, if you're looking, there's another one down there and something similar up here as well. So this is, just kind of this land of these very deep-seated bedrock failures. And in the upcoming image, you'll be able to see a little bit of structure. Bedding here is dipping underneath the Graben zone, and then it should be dipping back underneath from this side. So this is a general synclinal feature, but presumably there may be some shorter wavelength folding in the middle here that might give a basal failure plane here something to glide on, because I would think there would still be downslope glide along whatever plane is beneath and inside of this mountain. A pretty interesting detail here is to take that feature we just looked at and look at it in the context of other bedrock failures that are just in this particular sort of range here between the two drainages that you see at the right and left of the screen. And there's just a lot of them. I've probably missed several of them there, but this is very much the rule for many tens of miles in any direction from this location, wherever this stratigraphic interval is exposed at the surface. it tends to produce comparable topography, and that topography tends to fall apart in the ways that you see here. I like this one's pretty cool. Would appear to be sort of like a bidirectional failure, and you end up with this funny kind of triple junction looking set of scarps and maybe a faint subsided area there on top of this conical hill. Another one that's pretty interesting is up above the Bath County Pump Storage Hydro Facility. Beautiful scarps here on the land surface, and you can actually see how those disrupt the nearly flat lying bedding and converge well below the line of the summit there. Now, what do those converge onto? Conceptually, you would think that there is some kind of a basal glide plane that would allow this huge mass of rock to be moving faintly towards said pump storage hydro facility. I would say there's no evidence that's happening now. That would have been the case in the past. You don't identify that with LiDAR, but it does provide a great way to see what those two little planes look like, and you can actually go right where they meet. I presume the road cuts on this little access road here are probably pretty interesting to look at as well. I've never been up here. I have an idea to be in the vicinity of this facility. That's going to require special permission or something like that. But I would think that it would be possible to get a little more insight into what's going on here. Okay, so continuing to move to the north, we're actually going to take it up into West Virginia now, and we're going to be about 100 miles from where we started at Sinking Creek Mountain, but it's more of the same. Is this getting repetitive? Maybe, maybe not. I think they're great to look at, but what I'm trying to do here is just show you that this type of large-scale bedrock detachment, particularly on dip slopes, but sometimes maybe not necessarily on dip slopes, that is specifically associated with sandstone and shale topography, is just something that is very intrinsically valley and ridge, and it's something that you see everywhere. Still in the Upper Devonian here, this is more of a typical dip slope arrangement like the original Sinking Creek Mountain example. Another huge slide block at its widest, fully a kilometer wide, about 3,300 feet or so, and really nicely developed and crisp scarps up at the head of this thing. Presumably its toe, which is folding and buckling here, is steadily being removed by this stream, and that might be a way to keep this one maybe a little bit more active over time, assuming everything that we've seen so far is very much dormant and has been so for some time. But the jury's still out on that one. Throughout this entire area, this is on the southeast limb of the Elkins Valley anticline. It's pretty close to Elkins, West Virginia. You see this everywhere. And you do know that bedrock is involved because you see these little parallel features here. They actually have really faint little divots. Those are mechanical karst sinkholes where drainage is actually going into dilated joint planes. So it is a bedrock feature. The bedrock is so jointed and fractured and presumably thinly bedded that it allows movement at the surface that is perhaps not so rigid and brittle, so you have a way to produce some of the folding and things like that. But these are certainly rock slopes, and they of course are quite dynamic. And everywhere you go where there is quartzite or quartz aaronite and shale or slate interbedded that is supporting topography, you see features like this. This one is actually in the Blue Ridge. It's the Cambrian Irwin quartzite, Hampton Shale. Really impressive scarps and little grobens here up towards the summit. Again, you have a stream removing the toe of this feature. It's another big one, about 2,000 feet across. And even down into what's essentially the Piedmont, where you do find a little bit of quartzite topography on occasion, you keep seeing these big dip slope failures. And this is down near the Saratown Mountains in northern North Carolina. Pretty high grade quartzite, but it's interbedded with very aluminous rocks, and this nice clean dip slope ridge here is undergoing sort of a similar type of failure to what we've seen so far. So a question I have asked is, what does this represent? I mean, process-wise, why does this seem to happen in Appalachia? And why does it seem connected to this particular style of rock mass and rock mass strength and the topography it forms? And I wonder and would suggest that it might be just an erosional consequence, or sort of a product almost of the inerodibility of those really hard rocks. So back to a model here. If you have this nice, clean, even dip slope that produces a bunch of these really little inefficient channels, they have very little erosional energy, and they're not going to be able to do much to that strong cap rock. You detach that and turn it into this big lumpy thing with the gap up there, it's possible to produce actually a much higher order channel that's able to funnel a lot more drainage down. This material has been moved down slope. It's been sort of folded and jumbled, and maybe the discontinuities have dilated a bit, and it might make it more erodible. And now that it's got a higher order stream flowing across it, it turns into sort of a feedback loop that produces a style of erosion and a potential for erosion that might allow something like this to sort of keep up with the rest of the landscape. So moving the cap rock, moving that armoring rock mass down slope, it does reduce its potential energy, but as pointed out here, it's changing its position with respect to the stream network, and that might indeed have something to do with erodibility. And that's just an idea to throw out there, of course, just sort of thinking out loud. So if you look at that on Sinking Creek Mountain, there's one of the huge slide masses, and that would be kilometers or miles in length there. A couple of higher order streams are utilizing the dip there. This is actually sort of the largest stream that comes down the flank of the mountain anywhere. It has produced a huge fan of debris here that's been eroded off of this transported slide block. And cap rock has been removed here, or at least a portion of the cap rock has been removed as slide mass. That's broken up. That's being eroded by this higher order stream. And presumably somewhere down the road, it's going to be possible for this stream to actually breach here into these carbonate rocks and start removing rock from the interior of that anticline as well. And something similar would appear to be going on here at the end of this, end of the slide block. So if you compare these higher order streams to these really little narrow ones that have not had their drainages altered by displacement of some of this rock mass, you might get a sense that there is kind of a mechanistic relationship between moving some of the slope and erosional efficiency. So if you go back to the one in West Virginia, there are no channels on it. How does this mechanically and physically erode and feed material into this channel down here without any channels on it? The scarp slopes have very well developed channel networks, but this dip slope is essentially just a big flat slab. So it might be that the slope movement here is just part of helping that erosionally keep up with the rest of the landscape. So to put this into a block model here, got a big high order stream, some of these inefficient little tributaries that are flowing down to it. The high order stream starts incising there. A lot of relief develops, and the purple down here is going to represent a shale horizon. So this purple is really weak rock. That's going to be the strength limiter ultimately on the rock mass that is supporting this relief. And you might end up getting one of these big slide features that is going to fail ultimately within that weak rock. Once there's this hole in the armor on this ridge, a lot of steep material around it's going to keep slumping and falling in. This little drainage suddenly has a lot more drainage area, and it has access to weak rock that is beneath the armoring sandstone. Headward erosion is going to get back there. The drainage area is going to keep increasing, and sure enough, you might see that happening yet again. So the contention that I'm putting forth here is that a lot of the topography related to these really hard sandstone layers, when it develops with no surface channels and it's flanked by really high order streams that are flowing on very weak rock, it's going to be impossible for them to erode as quickly as these high order streams that are in the weak rock. So it's and Matt will like this. I'm going to use the word untenable again. they end up in what I call the GSA, an untenable geometry. They're essentially too steep and too prominent for their own good, because the strength of the mountain itself as a piece of topography is limited by the weak layers that are below the armor there. So fundamentally, yes, the sliding initiates a feedback loop where slides occur, it steepens the surroundings, more slides occur, drainage area increases, and ultimately the topography there gets consumed. So are these slopes that don't yet have slides, but maybe have slides sort of elsewhere along strike or something like that, are they on a hair trigger? So I've spent all this time showing you these big rock mass failures and trying to give evidence that that maybe their instability is just something that develops in this type of landscape. So can you see evidence for some kind of more recent disturbance, maybe human activity or something like that, maybe initiating something like this? And yes, that is the case. Going down into northeastern Tennessee now. This is southwest of Kingsport. Holston River behind you here, that's flowing from right to left. And if you're a landslide seeker, well, you're going to see an active slide there in the foreground. If you throw LiDAR on that, that's a particularly active lobe of a huge bedrock block slide that would appear to result from this excavation along a high wall in some kind of a quarry down here. I think this is Bayes sandstone. So that is different from the Siluro-Devonian sandstones in Virginia, but it's a major topography former here on Bayes Mountain in northeastern Tennessee. And the toe got cut off this slope along this very lengthy high wall, pretty large feature again. And that would appear to have set things in motion. And of course, the way the joints have worked to let this thing move and break apart, it's really cool to look at. Of course, there's no way to see that other than with LiDAR. So another feature here that might be in a similar context. This is in a little bit of a hollow, so there may be some colluvium and debris piling up here, but I'd say this one's active too. If you look really close, there's a head scarp here along the cut slope on the highway, and this lateral coming down actually offsets that head scarp. So it would appear that this is yet another very dynamic slope, but in this case, instead of stream erosion, humans came along and appear to have set bedrock in motion. And I will point out that I also cut a nice area to put like a dumpster and recycling facility here. And I would say, can't be sure, there might be a relationship between this especially deep cut and where that particularly active lobe of this big feature appears to be located. Several more of these going back to Virginia now are related to iron mining. There's a lot of iron ore extraction that went on in the early 20th century in the Central Valley and Ridge. What you're looking at here is either the Cali or the Circle mine, and I don't know which one it is. It's southwest of Iron Gate, Virginia. It's up above the James River, and very extensive high wall cut. When folks were doing this work, they would just cut a contour and end up with high walls that would be many tens of feet high. I'm not sure if you could get away with that these days, and you probably wouldn't want to, because in this particular case, this high wall actually produced a lot of instability upslope, and there's a very prominent surface crack or scarp that's developed, and the lateral runs right down here and intersects what appears to be sort of the most developed part of that high wall. Looking further upslope, there's cracking and scarping that goes really, really far up there, about 800 meters, about half a mile ground length from the high wall itself. And it certainly appears that you can follow a lateral all the way down here, and there's a pretty well-developed scarp running across this big, smooth, flat area as well. And sort of the calling card of this feature, and many like it that I'm about to show you, is the development of these anti-scarps, these uphill-facing scarps within this sort of sagging and slightly displacing mass above the high wall. I call those washboards because that's sort of what it looks like to me. You'll see a better one here in a couple slides. And they don't happen anywhere else in this landscape unless you're up above one of these big high wall cuts. So we're not far from the place I just showed you. This is close to Clifton Forge. Virginia. This is on the south side of the Jackson River. Interstate 64 is probably just a mile or two off to the right of the screen. And this hilltop has a nicely developed graben in it. That should look a little bit like some of the grabens that I showed in the Upper Devonian intervals earlier. The difference with this one is that this would appear to be anthropogenic because there was a big high wall cut somewhere further down slope. This one's a little bit tough to figure out because there may have been collapse of the high wall or something like that. But needless to say, there has been plenty of mine excavation at the base of this slope. And of course, you got the washboard features developing there as well. The interesting thing about the graben is it actually offsets a mining prospect trench. And what's cool about this one is that the physical size of the graben and where the high wall is and everything, and it sort of allows you to maybe take a stab at conjecturing what might be sort of inside of this big rock slope. The graben width is about 330 feet, and it has lovely sets of conjugate shear planes that make scarps that face each other. Again, just sort of hypothetically imposing what I think are maybe reasonable angles and projecting those downward. You end up looking at a really, really deep basal surface, if indeed there is a discrete basal shear plane that's allowing that to move and settle just a little bit, enough to accommodate the movement to allow that graben to drop down there. So looking down on the graben there, you can see its sort of innermost feature. There's the offset prospect trench, and then the outer bounds, and then the washboard, the anti-scarps. If you look off in the distance, there's another one. The high wall is pretty easy to see, and of course that washboard texture is easy to see as well. This is what it looks like without LiDAR. And probably this is why people haven't really talked about this in the past, is that the forest is completely recovered. You know, those workings are about 100 years old, and you have to strip that vegetation away to see what's going on. Really nicely developed. I think that maybe you can see there when I call it the washboard. These look good with a hillshade because the single light source makes it very clear that those are uphill facing scarps there. Again, a very large system, and they're specifically associated with that high wall. Nowhere else have I seen anti-scarp development like this associated with any type of slide in the valley and ridge, be that affecting rock mass or colluvium or debris. It seems to be something that is very specific to this type of scenario, and I presume that it is some expression of bedrock controlling what that looks like. A couple of years ago when I first started looking at these, I drafted something like this where rock would be dipping into the slope and there would be a basal failure plane that would sort of relate to the size of the high wall down there. This, of course, if you rotate those blocks quite a bit, you end up with a really interesting space problem underneath them. But hey, this is a slide. You got a bunch of dilation and crunched up rock. So I just kind of filled those spaces in my little drafted model with crunched up rock and void. Is there a plane like this that's pretty shallow that's allowing this texture to develop? I don't know. I would, having looked at the previous graben example, I'd say maybe not. But again, you know, I've not been here and looked at this one, and it's just hard to say. But going even further up slope, I would not be at all surprised if there's actually one more scarp that's reaching that far above. So the capacity to destabilize a slope here with a pretty modest excavation, if it's oriented on contour, seems pretty significant. Again, I've not encountered anything like this, you know, around quarries or anything else like that elsewhere in the Appalachians. Should be getting an idea of how this is going to go now. Got some scarps up there, got the washboard there. This one's only about 400 feet across, but well-developed high wall cut, same texture, and scarping that's spreading way on up the hill there. And the last one I think is the most impressive example. This is about 3,500 feet of continuous iron mine high wall. I won't show you what it looks like without LiDAR because it's just green, but you got the scarps. This one actually does have a pretty significant graben developed there and the good old washboard texture yet again. So it would appear, at least in these circumstances, that indeed the rock mass itself that's supporting this topography is sort of on the threshold of instability, and a deeper seated instability, to the point that tinkering with the integrity of that rock mass, even at this scale, is enough to set things moving just a little bit. And it's important to emphasize just a little bit. I mean, we're not looking at some huge, massive collapse and blocks going a kilometer downhill or something like that. But I would presume that there would be enough motion. Of course, there's enough motion to produce these surface scarps, that a buried infrastructure or something like that, would be impacted by this type of settling. But I freely admit, I hadn't been to any of these yet, so I don't know what this looks like in person. There is one very good example, though, in this region, and we're sort of making our way back into the original Schultz part of the Valley and Ridge at this point. The Galloping Highway on US 460 in Giles County. This is a bedrock slide. You can actually see a bedrock flat iron on the slope. This is right along the Narrows thrust zone, so this rock is very weak and brecciated. I think these layers here are actually completely overturned in the footwall of the fault. I may be wrong about that, but suffice it to say they are quite tectonically damaged. When 460 was cut through here, they removed the toe of a pre-existing, much older slide, and it reactivated, and it has been active ever since. So this is very much a similar scenario to what we just looked at with the iron mines, and it's another example of pretty modest excavation and material removal when executed along a contour, having a pretty big effect within topography that is just right on that edge of being sort of primed up for these bigger failures. And of course, problem with LiDAR, you look at one thing, you're always going to find something else you want to see. You can see another scarp over here with a lateral actually offsetting this road grade. So the Galloping Highway is the famous one, but there's most certainly an active slide over here whose toe was also removed by road construction. So to leave you with one final image, and this is actually back on the continuation of Sinking Creek Mountain. This is the new river flowing left to right. Railroad grade Norfolk Southern here coming along the river. One of the coolest looking slides I've seen in this new batch of LiDAR here. This one would be almost entirely a debris slide. It's actually debris from a big bedrock failure that you can't quite see off the screen here. But looking at the scarping that you see here, how crisp and defined it is. Another lateral here that's offsetting a road grade, sort of creeping its way down toward the railroad. If I were to see scarps that look like this on LiDAR, I would be very interested in going here in person to assess the activity history of this feature. I presume some of it got removed to build the railroad. I don't know if they have to come along and clean this up. I'm not sure how many people have even looked at something like this, and LiDAR gives you that opportunity to always see something different. But I think it does at this point, with the infrastructural development that's going on in this part of Virginia, and of course the pipeline word gets thrown around here quite a lot. There's a lot to think about in terms of engineering in these settings, and having an opportunity like this to sort of really see the truth of the landscape and how it's actually behaving may down the road be pretty significant in determining how you're actually going to have to work with it. So that's all I got. And if we got a few minutes here for questions, I'm happy to take them, but I think somebody's going to have to read them to me.